Hello, welcome, all of those joining us. You're arriving at the Theology and Imagination event this afternoon. Thank you so much for being here with us. Lovely to see some familiar faces. Hi, Beth, and some new faces too. Um, so this event is part of the HeartShift, which is a series of events which is taking place as an offshoot of the Leeds Festival of Kindness, Compassion and Wellbeing, and really exploring some deeper questions around with related topics around kindness, compassion and well-being. We're here with three speakers today, and we've also got Chris Baker as our host. I'm Flo Shalom. I'm just going to be supporting on the facilitation today. So we'd love this to be a kind of interactive event and invite you guys to be involved. So to start that spirit, I'll invite you to just say a quick hello in the chat box that's just at the bottom of Zoom. Just saying hello and where you're joining from geographically would be lovely, just to see the geographical spread of people joining us today. I'm actually joining from Rotterdam in the Netherlands myself, where I work remotely, but I'm from the UK originally. And I know we've got our team. Josh is based in Devon usually. Maybe Josh, you can give a wave. Great, I see your Iona's joining from Cheshire, Tina from Worcestershire, Chris, who is hosting from Stoke Newington in North London. Welcome. Melissa from North London as well, so you guys are neighbours. Tim from Oxford, Bill from Seattle. Brilliant, thanks for joining, Bill. Claire from Stokey too. Beth from Edinburgh. Oh, Beth, you're in Edinburgh these days, that's lovely. Doug from Worcester, Jan from East Devon. So really interesting to see the kind of geographical links as well. So lovely to have a few people from the same areas in joining us. So thanks so much for sharing. We're going to be together on Zoom, but we want to try and make this just a warm and welcoming space. So a few things to help with that, partly using the chat box and feeling free to kind of comment throughout people's presentations and ask questions. We'll have a kind of, after the presentations, we'll be having breakout rooms so that you can connect in smaller groups with each other. And we'll also be having a kind of Q&A discussion section as well. So hopefully there'll be lots of opportunity for you to listen and learn from the speakers, but also to share your own ideas and experiences with each other. But just before I introduce Chris and then the speakers, I would like to just invite us to just take a brief moment to pause together to really kind of arrive in this online space and in this event. And I'm going to invite that by just guiding a very short, minute or so mindfulness practice. So if you have practiced mindfulness or meditation, or perhaps lots before, this will be familiar to you, and if you haven't, it's very brief, so just use it as an opportunity to relax. But I'll invite you to just make sure that you're comfortable in your seat, and if you feel comfortable to do so, you can close your eyes, but otherwise you can just kind of gently lower your gaze away from the screen just for a few moments. And then just taking this opportunity to tune in with your breath, perhaps just taking a few slightly deeper breaths in and out, just to really help you make that connection, that conscious connection with your breath. And then from your breath, just widening your attention out to the rest of your body and just noticing how you're arriving in this space. Noticing any feelings in your body, or perhaps any emotions that are coming up, or any thoughts that you're still carrying with you from other parts of the day. Just observing how you're doing in this moment. And just allowing any distractions that are around you or within you to be there, just knowing that's natural. But just trying to bring that gentle curiosity and attention to yourself in this moment. And then from your own feelings and sensations, just in your mind's eye, not needing to open your eyes or your gaze, but in your mind's eye, just being aware that you're with a group of people on the other side of the screen, that you're joined together with others coming together today to explore this topic of theology and imagination. That you've all been drawn to explore this topic in more depth. And so in that way, we are a small temporary community with each other. And just breathing into that awareness that you're not alone in this moment. And with a few final deep breaths, whenever you feel ready, I'll invite you to open your eyes if they've been closed, or bring your gaze back up to the screen in whatever way you'd like. So thank you for taking a little moment just to arrive. And just a few very practical Zoom things. I'll ask you if you can to be on mute when you're not talking, just so that we don't get any background noise. And it's lovely to see so many of your faces on the video. We will be recording this event. If you're not speaking, you won't appear on the recording. But if you speak, then just being aware that you will, or if there's a bit of background noise from your camera, then you might appear very momentarily. But we really love to create that atmosphere where we can see each other's faces. So really lovely to see so many of you. So to explain a little bit more of the kind of background of this event and the kind of context that we're coming into, I'm now going to hand over to Professor Chris Baker. So Chris is the William Temple Professor of Religion and Public Life at Goldsmiths, University of London, and Director of Research at the William Temple Foundation. So he's going to tell you a bit more about this event and briefly about the William Temple Foundation as well. So I'll hand over to Chris.
Thank you, Flo, very much. And hello, everyone. It's lovely to see you all. Welcome to the second of our webinar series. So a very quick word about William Temple Foundation. We were established in 1947, actually, going back quite a few years now, in memory of Archbishop William Temple, who was Archbishop of Canterbury during the Second World War, and is probably still held to be the greatest Anglican social thinker, probably of all time. One of the main things he did out of many was to reimagine what British society could be after the Second World War. And he came up with this concept of the welfare state, which he developed in a very popular book called Christianity and Social Order, which was published in 1942, the very same year of the Beveridge Report, which was in a way the kind of the report that put into practice, if you like, some of the ideas that Temple was developing, and he and Beveridge worked very closely together. So our role really in life is to try and develop that kind of link between theology, religion, belief, and the public square. And at Goldsmiths, my Goldsmiths hat on, we do a lot of work around policy. How can we create better policy around religion and belief? But it's a really great pleasure with the foundation hat on to welcome you to this space. This very much fits into our remit of trying to create public spaces where we can discuss the linkages between theology, belief, philosophy, politics, activism, and social transformation. So this is the second, as I said, of our webinars series, in which we're trying to explore the contours of a new activism and a new politics and a new spirituality, all of which seem to be emerging as a response to the huge and multiple crises and challenges that are facing our society and our world. It feels like, in a hopeful way, there's a kind of groundswell of alternative thinking, alternative imagining, and alternative acting. And we're trying to, in this series, along with lots of other people, get a sense of what's it mean, what's it all about, how's it making a difference. So in this series, we're trying to be very interdisciplinary. We're trying to bring together lots of different walks of life and disciplines. So in the future, we'll be looking at the world of business and ethics, ecumenism, interfaith work. But this particular webinar, we're going to focus on theology as a kind of source for reimagining the kind of world that we want to live in. But we're very blessed today to have three people who use their theology in a very active way. So I guess part of maybe the historical problem with theology is it's been seen as something rather musty and disconnected from the world. But I think that's changing rapidly as people are beginning to wake up to the fact that we need to find deeper sources of meaning and imagination, and theology, philosophy, spirituality all fit into that realm. So the purpose of today's event is to listen in really on a conversation between three people who use theology and use theological imagination to shape what they do. And what they do is often very grounded, very practical, very local. It's a kind of local activism. But of course, it has these kind of roots into more universal truths. And I think at its best, theology allows us to kind of connect universal truths with very sort of local contexts and situations. So we're really looking forward to this conversation about how theological themes, theological ideas, theological imaginings can help resource our resistance to what is going on and to reimagine alternative futures. And I know you're going to enjoy very much the flow of the conversation. And it's a great pleasure and privilege to have these three people who responded to my invitation to come onto this event. So I'm going to hand back to Flo now, who will introduce them. Thanks, Flo.
Thank you, Chris. So without further ado, then we'll move on to introducing those speakers. So the first of which is Claire Martin. So Claire is the Communications Manager and Resilience Programme Leader at St Ethelburga's Centre for Peace and Reconciliation. So St Ethelburga's builds community resilience for times of ecological and social emergency, for those who haven't heard of the amazing centre's work. Claire brings more than 10 years of experience of facilitating groups for the sake of inner inquiry and outer change. So we're really looking forward to hearing from her her reflections on this topic today. Over to you, Claire.
Oh, thank you, Flo, and thank you, Chris. Yeah, I really feel very honored to be here with you today to talk about a subject that I feel very excited about. And just to give a bit of background on where I'm coming from, I was raised in the Christian faith, and I now follow a Sufi tradition. So we've been asked, each of us has been asked to offer three theological ideas that link to climate emergency and talk about how these concepts help us to imagine alternative visions for the future. So the first theological idea that I'd like to offer is from Psalm 36. And it's, "In thy light shall we see light." So this is the idea that we perceive divinity, we perceive God, or we perceive spiritual truths, because within us, we hold a seed of that divine consciousness. And so by the light of the soul, we see truly. Or I think the same principle applies, even if a spiritual language doesn't land with you. So by the light of your deepest values, you see most truly. And I think this might sound like quite an abstract idea, and I feel that it's very, very practical. I think, you know, when we're speaking about imagining ourselves in a paradigm beyond the paradigm that we're in now, it seems it's really important, I think, not to leap over the part where we look at the truth of where we are. And I think we live in an age of unbearable truths. So just recently, I learned of a report that was published not long ago on behalf of the UK Ministry of Defence. And this was a piece of research that was commissioned to look into what would be the defense and security implications of climate change that the UK government needs to plan for. And what was really striking about this report was that it proceeded on the basis that a 3.5 degree rise in global temperature is likely this century. So that's what our defense forces are planning for. And so what does that mean? That means catastrophe on an unimaginable scale that will make the situation that we are all exhausted from witnessing and enduring now appear mild by comparison. And I think there's a real danger, you know, as kind of small, messy, vulnerable human beings, that we're traumatized by trying to take in these truths, that we're paralyzed, that we're numbed out, that we're shattered by them individually and collectively as a society. And so I think this principle, in thy light shall we see light, by the light of what is true and holy and divine within us, then we gain nourishment and strength to witness and hold the truths that we have to take in now. And also I think there's something about, you know, when I imagine illuminating the truth of this time by the light of my soul, I kind of imagine myself holding this light like a candle. And this light, my light, illuminates a circle around me that is in proportion to me as a human being. And I think this isn't about relating to the time that we're in only in a personal way or only in a local way. But I think when you look from the light of your soul, then you see what it is that you are called to know, to love, to relate to with meaning in this time. So that's my first theological idea that I'd like to offer into this conversation. And the second one is from John O'Donoghue. And he writes, some of you may know, he's a beautiful poet. This is from Anam Cara. He's a Christian, but he brings through this incredible wild land-infused Celtic spirituality into his Christianity. He writes, the human person is a threshold where many infinities meet. And he talks about how we are the custodians of these deep and ancient thresholds. So this is thresholds between the inner and the outer, thresholds between the divine and the human, between the spirit within you, the spirit of the land. And I love this language that he uses, that we within us are these precious ancient thresholds that don't belong to us, and to which we have a relationship of custodianship. It's this attitude of respectfulness. So when we're speaking about imagining ourselves into a future, I think this principle invites us to look at the attitude with which we go to the inner, and invites us to ask, whose imagination are we consulting? rather than having this appropriative or exploitative attitude towards the imagination. I'm going to go there. I'm going to find a tool. I'm going to find an image that I can then use to fix this problem. That we go to that threshold as custodians of something sacred and precious. And that there we're, in entering the imaginal, we're entering a place of mystery that is vaster than us and that is sacred. And the last principle that I'd like to offer is this idea that Earth is a sovereign, sacred being who has a soul. And this is a belief that belongs to my Sufi tradition. And this is a quote from Llewellyn Vaughan-Lee. He writes, "If we do not take the foundational step of returning our consciousness to the living earth, reconnecting to the ground under our feet, the future will not come alive." So again, this is the idea that Earth has her own agency and intelligence, and that we may participate in her imagination. And I just finally wanted to kind of share a story that for me really speaks to this theme. And this is a story from a book called Wilding by Isabel Tree. And this is the story of how Isabel and her husband rewilded their farm, which for decades had been used for industrial scale agriculture. And they did this, they did this kind of, basically they created this boundary around the land, and they just left nature to reweave itself back to life without interference. And it's a very inspiring and hopeful story, because you see how this kind of wild intelligence within life, when it's given the freedom to express itself, creates this exponential regeneration that you kind of wouldn't imagine would be possible by human beings manipulating it through conservation practices. Anyway, there's this part in the book where she talks about how much courage it took to allow their field, like acres and acres and acres of their land, to become overgrown with weeds, because this was very scandalous to all of their neighbors and to all of the other landowners around. They had these acres and acres of thistles. But they really held to this determination. And then one day in springtime, thousands upon thousands of painted lady butterflies descended on their land, thousands upon thousands of them. And they descended on these thistles, and they fed on them, and they mated, and they pupated, and people came from all around to see this kind of miraculous, beauty of these painted lady butterflies. And what's quite incredible about the painted lady butterflies, they have the longest migrational route of any butterfly. So all the way from the deserts of Africa up to the Arctic Circle. And it can take 6 generations of butterflies to complete the whole migrational route. And in the book, she sort of marvels at this, that these creatures with this brain the size of a pinhead can be born and come to life in some random farm in England. And somehow each generation knows how to travel the stretch of the migrational route that's theirs to live. And then they come down and they mate and they die, and the next generation rises to fly the next period of the migrational route. And it's such a beautiful story. And for me, it says something very profound about this question of whose imagination that we're consulting when we try to imagine ourselves into the future. And that there's this possibility of rooting into this primal intelligence that belongs to life, that can instruct us how to travel just our part of the story that leads maybe to planting a seed of the future that takes us beyond where we are now. So that's me. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Claire. Really beautiful story and beautiful sharing. And yeah, I see that some people, there's a reactions button at the bottom of Zoom where you can give a kind of little round of applause if you've just to show appreciation for what Claire has shared. And just to invite, we are going to hear from our next two speakers now, but if you have any comments or any questions that you'd like to pose to Claire, feel free to share them in the chat now, and even if we can't come to them immediately, we will get to them in the Q&A section of our discussion later on. But now I'm going to introduce our next speaker, which is Sam Wernham. So Reverend Sam Wernham is the creator and curator of Wild Spirit Community, a web of contemplative groups orientated around spiritual ecology. And Sam is also currently training for ordination, again, in the Church of England, alongside doctoral research in her existing pioneer ministry at Canterbury Christ Church. So really a rich range of experiences around theology and imagination, and I really look forward to hearing what Sam has to share with us. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Flo, and hello everyone. It's really good to come together. So I just want to offer a little overview of the three things that I'm going to try and do. And I want to bracket those three things with a little bit of meditative silence at the beginning and the end, just so that you can be preparing for that. I want to reflect a little bit on the word theology. I want to say something about prophecy, and I want to share three practices from the Christian tradition in my experience that we use in Wild Church and Wild Monastics. So I'll do my best to do all that in 10 minutes. But to start with, I'd like to invite you to just join me to, let's remember that beautiful meditative exercise that Flo invited us into, just to kind of mark a pause between the richness of what we've received from Claire and where we're going next. So if you want to close your eyes for a moment or just drop your gaze, let's just take a moment to just come back into our bodies and to breathe. Thank you. So what do I understand by theology, or perhaps theology, just to bring in a bit of gender balance there? For me, it's about conversations. It's about storytelling. It's about conversations that we have with that great mystery that Claire has spoken of so beautifully, and the kind of conversations that we have with each other, both in the present and also drawing upon the kind of wisdom pools of our traditions, whatever they may be. And I think also listening for the voices of the future as well. So all of those conversations in relation to the mystery, which I sometimes call God, is what I understand by theology. And in terms of imagining, in my tradition, or my limited experience of my tradition, part of what I'm drawing upon is the prophets, is those that have gone before, that have faced crisis and have spoken words of lament, words of protest, and that have also drawn very deeply on their own capacity as mystics. So I want to just bring them in to start with, and I'd like to start with Amos. I mean, there are many female and male prophets in the Hebrew and in the Christian tradition, and I'd like to let Amos speak. His reading was spoken in the Church of England last Sunday, and just very briefly, there's just a couple of verses, and this is what he says, speaking for himself and perhaps speaking with the voice of the divine. He says, I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. But let justice roll down like waters, and kindness like an ever-flowing stream. And certainly for me, that voice, that's something I can really relate to. I really struggle with my own tradition, particularly in its more institutional forms. Perhaps there are others of us here. Whatever you're drawing upon, whether that's secular or spiritual traditions and institutions, I imagine I'm not the only one that struggles. And Claire has obviously spoken powerfully to some of the realities that we're facing at the moment. So how are we going to draw upon this justice that rolls down like waters, this kindness that is an ever-flowing stream? And I want to share another prophetic image, and this is from Ezekiel, who's a favourite of mine, and he is speaking out of a very difficult time in his own life, sort of politically, socially, a time of exile, a time of great suffering for his community. And he pictures, his experience is that he's living in a valley of dry bones. And the divine speaks to him and says, prophesy to these bones. And in prophesying, what happens is those bones start to knit together and they start to be infleshed in a new way. And then into them is breathed the breath of the Spirit, and a new life, a new possibility awakens, a new hope. And I find that an incredibly powerful image. And I think it has a question for all of us, really, that what are the bones in all kinds of ways, both the painfulness of that, but also what are the core values? What are the key stories? What are the core practices that we can gather from our own experience, from our traditions? And how can we put contemporary flesh upon those, and how can we breathe them to life? So I'd like to offer kind of three particular ways that I have been in the good company of my companions in Wild Church and Wild Monastics, how we've been kind of finding the bones, if you like, of the Christian tradition. And the first of those I'd like to introduce to you is pilgrimage. And particularly a form that comes from the Celtic tradition. It's often called peregrinatio, and it's a form of pilgrimage that is not like the form that developed later in the medieval period, where you went off on a journey to go to a special and sacred place. It's not that kind of pilgrimage. Peregrinatio, I interpret it as wandering, like peregrination, that's where we get that word from. Wandering or wondering, perhaps, that wherever we are, whatever we're facing, that perhaps we can wander into that and wonder about it. And in the tradition, it said that the way that we wandered was pro amore Christi, for the love of Christ. In love, we wander in love, with love, and we wander as hospitae mundi, as guests of the world, as Claire was saying, not as people that are there to appropriate, or to dominate, that are in control, not as hosts, but as guests, opening to the holiness in every moment and in every place. So that's the first practice that I'd like to remind us of. And we practice this in Wild Church, in walking the land, and as a way of life, really. And the second is about honouring different ways of knowing. And this goes, again, right back to the beginnings of the Christian tradition, and it also has its roots in the Jewish tradition. And in the Middle Ages, it became developed as a kind of fourfold way of knowing. I like to think of it as a fourfold wisdom way. And sometimes it's called the quadriga. And I think it's particularly important for those of us that are carrying in our backpacks traditions that hold stories. Because what it reminds us is that, you know, the first way of knowing that's recognized, which is about taking things literally, but taking things literally is not the only way of knowing. And I think any of us that work with scripture, that's very important to bear that in mind. And so the second way of knowing is, you know, is to look metaphorically. The third way of knowing is to open our hearts. And the final way of knowing is to recognize that there's a great deal that we don't know, and that sometimes being silent and just opening through meditation to the mysteries is the way we need to go. And the very last practice that I'd like to share with you is what's called the prayer of the heart. And again, it's a very ancient practice. It goes back to the desert mothers and fathers. And it's a way of living that's about opening our heart to all of who we are. And I'd just like to finish by returning to that moment of silence, you know, inviting us to bring our awareness into our hearts, to get back in touch with our breath and our bodies. And to breathe out our hopes and our kindness into the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. And yeah, inviting again, if anyone wants to give a reaction, either with the reactions button or with a gesture, it's very welcome. Thank you for all you shared. Really beautiful to hear, both you, yourself and Claire, and lovely that you touched upon kindness there, Sam, because as Josh mentioned in the chat box, it's actually World Kindness Day today, so really beautiful to bring that theme into our conversation. So again, inviting you, if you have questions or comments, you can feel free to write in the chat box. We're going to move on to our third speaker before going into kind of breakout rooms and more interaction. So I'm going to introduce our third and final speaker for today, Reverend Dr. John Reeder, who is retired as the rector of Ironstone Benefice, which is 8 rural churches in North Oxfordshire. He actually retired this year, having served most of his ordained ministry in rural parishes. He's a senior research fellow of the William Temple Foundation and an honorary senior lecturer in the Institute of Education at the University of Worcester. So really lovely to have you here with us, John, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Flo. Thank you, everybody. I'm not sure this is going to fit quite as neatly, perhaps, as it might do. I suppose because I come from a fairly sort of traditional theological educational background, I have struggled for most of my ministry with how to relate the theology, the doctrine, if you like, the propositional statements that you're given when you're trained, with the practice of actually being a parish priest. And so for the last however many years, I've been trying to search for a new conceptuality, new ideas which can help me relate, if you like, the theory to the practice. My starting point really was encountering liberation theology in the 1980s, because it seemed to me that theology was being practiced the wrong way around. You had the theory, you had the practice. But when I encountered people who were actually struggling directly with situations that they were encountering, and then trying to work out from there actually what to do, and then to see how the theology, the ideas, if you like, might relate to that, that was what gave me that first sort of line of inspiration. So, as I say, I've been searching for sort of a new conceptuality. And at that stage, I could see connections between liberation theology and what in those days were called new social movements. This is going back to the 1980s. So the new social movements were things like the environmental movement as it was starting then, feminism, anti-racism, anti-colonialism, etc. All of these sort of familiar resistances to and reactions against, if you like, the establishments and the institutions as they operated. And it was also to do with, it's not theory, it's what you do, it's what you put into practice, how you live it out. And one of our great sort of mentors, as Chris Baker would know, John Addison, developed this thing: by their fruits ye shall know them. It's how it lives out in practice is the real test, if you like, of what it is you say and what you believe. And if anybody wants to know, there were a couple of books that I found particularly helpful. There was a book by a guy called Robert Schreiter called Constructing Local Theologies, and then Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which were also sources of inspiration to me in those early days. Okay, so the second one would sort of go something like this. It was the practical encounters that I had as a parish priest, which shaped, if you like, the practice and the theories. It's while I was a parish priest in Shropshire, as Flo has said, I've been largely rural. So South Shropshire is pretty rural. And again, this is the 1980s, the use of pesticides on farms that some of the people were actually complaining about and reacting to, concerned about the impact upon themselves and upon the health of their children. So a group of us established an environmental area on a piece of land next door to one of my churches, which was interesting because the local farming community said, what the hell are they doing? You know, they objected to this, but it was an attempt to raise people's awareness. It wasn't just the thing in itself, it was actually drawing attention to, here's a series of issues that we should be concerned about, so what are we going to do about it? And then in 2001, I was in Worcestershire, some of you are in Worcestershire, in the midst of the foot and mouth outbreak, which was a significant time, really, in terms of rural ministry across the country. And there was a particular episode, as parish priest, I went in on a regular basis to visit a local mums and toddlers group. So you got the mums there with their babies and the toddlers. And next door to the estate from which some of those mums came, sheep and lambs were being shot and then burned just down the road from the school. And as I sat there in that group, I reached the point where I almost had to leave. I couldn't bear it. I thought, here are other forms of life and babies being slaughtered in our name. And it was almost a moment of epiphany. I just couldn't cope with it. I thought, this is life. What are we doing to other forms of life? So for me, if you like, that focused very much my concerns, my feelings, that there was far more to this than we really understood. And our responsibilities for other forms of life, really, we were not taking seriously, we're not seeing through. So that was deeply moving and deeply damaging, if you like. So from then on, and related to that, I wanted to find ideas which said, how do we relate the human and the non-human, the animate and the inanimate? How do we bring these two together and understand that we are all in it together, that we're related, we're connected, etc. Things that my other two co-speakers, I'm sure, would identify with. And one of the criticisms, if you like, within the environmental movement is that an understanding of human autonomy, which puts us in charge, really has to be brought into question. And it's either going beyond that or for searching for other forms of autonomy. And again, the environmental movement has said, who and what are we as human beings? How do we relate to the wider creation? And I suppose I've thought, even from the 1980s, that theology was going to have to reconfigure itself in terms of our understanding of our relationship with the whole of creation and the natural world. In terms of theological resources, a book by an American theologian called Catherine Keller called Cloud of the Impossible, I found very helpful, was bringing together some of the philosophical ideas I'm interested in, but also the theology behind it as well. How do we understand our relationship with God? Tension between proximity and distance. She talks about the crowd. We're all in this together. We're interrelated. But alongside that, you get the cloud, if you like, the cloud of unknowing from the Christian tradition, the mystical, the apophatic, and trying to hold those together somehow in tension seems to be a creative and a necessary way of actually moving forward, if you like. So going through that, some of us have tried, and you're always putting labels on these things, sorry, philosophers, if you like do this, to construct something we call relational Christian realism. There you are, there's a label for you. Nobody else bothers about it, it's fine. But it's picking up this thing that we're all of us, we're embodied, we're embedded, we're relational, okay? All of those things, saying that we are grounded. We have to understand ourselves as human beings in that way. There's also questions about the future. And some theologians and also philosophers talk about the idea of the messianic. What is this future? And I don't think this is a distant future. This is the here and now future. This is what we have to be able to do in the moment, here and now, not in some strange projected, idealized thing that might not be the case. Because if that's all you worry about, you'll sit back and do nothing. You won't change anything. It's got to be how you are in the moment. And there's a very powerful idea from a biblical theologian called Chris Rowland, that when I heard it struck me. He said the early Christians both believed that the kingdom of God had come, it was a present reality. And yet what we saw around us most of the time seemed to give the lie to that. And yet despite that, the early Christians believed that the kingdom of God is here and now. And again, it's holding those two things in tension. I found that extremely powerful, an extremely useful way into this. Then just finally, Sam, you talked about knowledge and different ways of knowing. And I'd like just to add something to that as well, or another way of looking at it. There's knowledge as information. We are in an age when, because of the digital, so much of what we receive comes to us as information. But there's knowledge as participation, as actually being engaged, as being involved, as knowing in a different way. And that seems to me, if you like, much more consonant with the Christian tradition, actually being directly engaged and involved. And that brings us back to this idea of by their fruits ye shall know them. Again, what colleague and mentor John Abberton called material religious practices. It's what we do that, if you like, manifests what it is that we actually believe, that what we feel. Current things I'm involved in, there's a group called the Christian Rural Environmental Studies Group, which develops things alongside EcoChurch. If anybody's heard of EcoChurch, these are good sort of practical examples. Yeah, two of my former churches in Ironstone are now got bronze award in EcoChurches. So these are ways of raising people's awareness and getting them directly involved. So I would commend those sort of movements to you. Right, I've had my 10 minutes. Thank you, Flo.
Thank you so much, John. And again, inviting if you would like to show appreciation to John in a reaction on your Zoom or with a gesture, that's very welcome. Thank you so much, Claire, Sam and John. Such wonderful, rich, deep insights and wisdom shared in your presentations. We are slightly over time, but this event is going on till 3:10, and what we'd like to do now is just give you guys between 5 and 10 minutes just in small discussion breakout rooms with each other, just to share and reflect on what you've heard, really. So I'm going to put in the chat box just a few kind of prompts that can help guide your discussion, but essentially it's just introducing yourself to the small group. You'll likely be in a group of 3, reflecting on the presentations, perhaps one or 2 key points that stood out for you. And if you get the time, reflecting on, in your experience, how can theology and imagination become more relevant in the modern world? And then we'll come back just before 3 o'clock to have a short Q&A with the speakers for further reflections. So yeah, you'll see a box pop up now to take you to your breakout rooms, and see you back here in just under 10 minutes. Hi, welcome back, Josh and Iona. We're just waiting for others to return from the breakout rooms. So you all have noticed you got the 60-second warning, and some people are holding on till the last second. There's everyone back now. So welcome back, everyone. Sorry, it's always, it's never long enough, I think, in smaller discussions, especially with such a rich topic as this, but I hope that you managed to make a connection, an initial connection with each other, at least, to start sharing ideas on these important topics. So it's just drawing towards 3 o'clock now, and so we're running slightly short of time, but we'd love to just have the last 5 or 10 minutes or so of this event just to share questions with the speakers in a larger group. So inviting everyone that's still here, that's able to stay for the last 10 minutes, to share any questions you have for the speakers in the chat box. And I think that I'll also, maybe just whilst people are writing and reflecting on their questions, I might just ask John, Claire and Sam if they have any reflections on each other's presentations that they'd like to share in these moments.
I could start if you like.
Go for it.
I was actually on a seminar yesterday about rewilding, and so I wanted to just pick up on that image and story that Claire shared about allowing things, you know, how it put a fence around and they let their farm go wild, and how hard it was to actually, in that prophetic way, to get on and do that in the midst of very different paradigms that surrounded them. But out of that came the most kind of unimaginable blessing, really, of all these butterflies. So I just wanted to pick up on that and appreciate that, really. I found that very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, that was indeed a really powerful, beautiful image shared. So thank you for reflecting that back to Claire. Claire and or John, would you like to share any reflections on each other's presentations?
Can I just say, it's part of the frustration of the technology that to actually take in and absorb what other people are saying. I would find it easier to make the connections if I'd actually got some text in front of me to say, oh yes, I sort of picked up some things as we were going through. But I'm sure there's so much more there in terms of the interaction that could be sort of more accurately reflected, if you like. But this is the only way we can do it at the moment, so it's the only way we can do it. So yeah. Yeah,
no, definitely. And picking up on some of the points you shared, John, about being embodied, but yeah, like the challenge of finding ways to be embodied in this online space, which feels a bit disembodied. Yeah, it does sometimes come up for sure. So thank you for being honest and sharing that. And Claire, anything you'd like to share? And just before handing to Claire, just inviting, if anyone has any questions, please do pop them in the chat. Otherwise, after Claire, I'm going to hand over to Chris in case he's got any questions. So over to you, Claire.
Yeah, thank you. I think the things that are really staying with me from your presentations, Sam and John. Sam, it was the part where you were talking about, and I can't actually remember the piece of scripture that you were referencing, so forgive me, but it's this phrase of prophesying to the bones, and this image that it gave me of someone in a place of just utter and abject desolation and death in a graveyard, and engaging in prophecy from that place. And then John, from your presentation, I think the moment where you talked about going to visit this mother and baby group, I have a 7-year-old daughter. I'm not that far from that kind of context. And I really was not expecting where you were going to take that story, but that you're sitting there with children and mums and then hearing this kind of unbearable slaughter happening, and the juxtaposition of those images. Those are the things from your presentations. Those images are really staying with me, and I think they just reflect my feeling of, you know, we're striving to engage imagination that can transcend us out of a place that feels bleak and desolate, and who's kind of, yeah. I don't know. I think for me, just personally, those two images encapsulated, like, if we're in a really true place when we're asking this question and we're engaging that inquiry, that's where we are. We're in a graveyard surrounded by bones, and we're listening to a slaughter that breaks our hearts. And I don't know if I have an answer to speak to that, but I feel like it's really, really important to stay in that place, to start from that place. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, thank you. That's a really powerful way of picking up on the imagery, that Sam and John brought into their discussions, and also really, really resonating with the points that you've observed from each other being about those very embodied, direct, kind of visceral experiences in different ways that people have had, and in sharing that, it kind of instigates each other's imagination. So that's really powerful to hear. So I'm just, for the final 5 minutes, I'm just going to hand over to Chris, actually, to see if you've got any questions you would like to share, Chris, or anything to draw us to a close otherwise.
I'm just checking, Flo, that no one else has got any questions from the wider group. I've got a few things to say, but can I just check whether there's anyone burning to say anything before I dip in, as it were? If not, that's absolutely fine. I mean, it's part of the, as John was saying, it's part of the technology, isn't it? And the kind of constriction of time. And I don't know about you, but I'm afraid I missed a lot of what Claire was saying, because she seemed to drop out, and I don't know whether I just experienced an outage at that point or whether we all did. But so sorry, Claire, I missed some of what you said. But I've got some very rich themes that I'm left with, and you know, in an ideal world there'll be time to really unpack them and explore them. So I've got the theme of incarnation, picking out what Claire said, you know, the human and the divine becoming intermingled, or another way of looking at the theological idea of incarnation is to say that materiality is infused with the spirit and love of God. Now, it seems a very important starting point for all of us. But then I heard Sam referring to the practice of lament, the practice of prophecy, so speaking out to truth, speaking to truth, and offering public witness to the suffering of the world as a political and spiritual statement. That seems to be a very important theological tool in our toolbox. John, you talked about the impact of liberation theology on your work, so the theme of liberation and the work of Paulo Freire, you know, bringing consciousness, bringing us to a critical consciousness, to use a Marxist term. So our sight isn't clouded over by the kind of baubles of the world, but we see, we learn, we take courage, we dare to own our own radical thinking and not be told to shut up by anyone. But if all that sounds very sort of activist and rather intemperate, then I was really drawn towards Sam's beautiful idea of pilgrimage and being a guest in the world, and wandering through the world. So for me, what I've picked up from today, which is a kind of tension there, and it's not really resolvable. It's the tension between the prophecy and the lament, and the kind of the hot anger, if you like, the what's going on, that Claire also picked up in her last remarks, with this idea of also having to hold him back, being always open to the wonder of the world and the beautiful mystery of what the incarnation is, however we understand that term to be. So thank you to our speakers for a very rich afternoon, and despite the confinements of time and technology, I've certainly got a lot to go away and think about. So thank you all very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you so much everyone for joining, and thank you so much again to the speakers. It was a really really beautiful experience to be together. One final small thing, I'd love to just take a screenshot of us, just so that we have a image from the event. If you'd prefer not to be in that, you can turn your camera off, but if you otherwise, invite you to just smile for the camera, so to say. And yeah, do follow the William Temple Foundation and HeartShift, and for further details of future HeartShift events. And we'll send you a follow-up email with the recording link and that kind of thing as well. So thank you all so much. And yeah, thanks again, Claire, John and Sam. Have a lovely afternoon.